They didn't hear the jungle at first. Not the rustling of leaves. Not the distant footsteps. Not the thousands of enemy soldiers surrounding them. In a tightening circle, all they heard was their own breathing, 800 Marines, scattered across hastily dug trenches on a remote Pacific island, laying in the dirt beneath a moonless sky, rifles against their chests, fingers trembling. Every man ordered to hold fire. No matter what they heard coming from the darkness, some believed they were abandoned. Others thought command miscalculated. But the truth was far more unsettling. They wanted this hours earlier. Scouts had returned with impossible news. Multiple Japanese battalions elite, experienced and outnumbering them 3-1, were marching through the jungle, surrounding their position from all sides. Communications had been shredded by artillery. Reinforcements wouldn't arrive until morning. Escape routes were collapsing. Any rational commander would have ordered a retreat, but these Marines didn't retreat. They dug in, pulled back into tighter formations, concealed their machine guns, and waited silently, letting the enemy close the trap around them. It felt like suicide. It looked like surrender. No one spoke of the plan, not fully, not out loud, because even they weren't sure it would work. The jungle was thick enough to swallow sound and sight, cutting them off from command. Supplies were running low. Ammunition had to be rationed. Water was warm and scarce. Men were exhausted, fighting fever, infection, fear. Still, they held position, somewhere along the line. One Marine whispered the question every man was thinking: why are we letting them surround us? No one answered. Not yet. Instead, they listened as the forest began to change. The insects stopped chirping. Wind stalled. And then came the unmistakable sound of boots, thousands of them moving slowly, deliberately, encircling their lines like a predator tightening its jaws. The Marines stayed silent. They could see dark silhouettes crossing through the trees, shadows slipping past their trenches. Convinced the Americans were already defeated, too. Broken to resist, they didn't know the Marines had prepared firing lanes that crisscrossed the jungle. They didn't know artillery coordinates had been pre-registered to rain shells inside the defensive perimeter. They didn't know every inch of the battlefield had been mapped, measured, and turned into a calculated kill zone. The Japanese believed they were cornering prey. They had no idea they were walking into a trap. One Marine clenched his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Another whispered a prayer. Officers waited for a single signal, one flare to ignite the night, but not yet, not until the enemy was close enough that escape became impossible, because this wasn't just a battle. It was a gamble, a sacrifice, a deliberate invitation to annihilation, theirs or the enemy's. The question wasn't whether they would fight. The question was why their commanders would risk everything on a tactic so dangerous, so suicidal, that history nearly forgot it ever happened. And at sunrise, the world would learn the answer. Before the jungle went silent, before the Marines lay waiting in the dark, there was the island, an unforgiving stretch of volcanic soil, mangrove swamps and jagged coral that looked insignificant on a map. But to both armies, it was priceless. The United States needed it to secure their island hopping campaign, a strategy designed to cut through the Pacific like a blade skipping, heavily fortified. Japanese strongholds and seizing islands that offered airstrips, artillery positions, and naval staging grounds. Each captured island brought them one step closer to the Japanese mainland, tightening the noose, severing supply lines, and securing dominance in the Pacific skies. The Japanese understood this. Every island lost was another artery severed, another step toward defeat. Their strategy was simple: make each capture so costly, so blood-soaked, that America would consider quitting the war long before reaching Tokyo. This island was no exception. It guarded vital shipping lanes and housed terrain perfect for building forward air bases. If the U.S. could hold it, American bombers could launch deeper strikes into Japanese territory. If they failed, momentum in the Pacific would stall and thousands more Americans would die retaking ground that should never have been lost. For the Marines stationed there, this wasn't just a battle. It was the thin line on which the future of the Pacific War hung. Command of the Marine Battalion fell to men hardened by months of jungle, combat officers who had watched friends fall in Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and New Georgia. They were familiar with Japanese tactics, relentless night assaults, close quarters fighting, psychological warfare, and lethal infiltration teams trained to slip behind lines and slit throats while soldiers slept. But what made this island different was intelligence. Scouts intercepted coded transmissions days before the attack. Reports of Japanese units regrouping inland, pulling back from shoreline defenses, disappearing into thick jungle. At first, it looked like a retreat, a sign they had accepted defeat, but seasoned officers knew better. Japan didn't retreat from islands like this. They burrowed in dug caves into hillsides, stockpiled ammunition underground, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Their doctrine was built around one brutal principle: let the Americans think they've won, then kill them as they celebrate. As supplies arrived and U.S. engineers began bulldozing airstrip foundations, the Marines noticed the patterns: no snipers, no scattered resistance, no harassment fire. It was too quiet, too easy. And the quiet terrified them. By late afternoon, scouts reported fresh bootprints, hundreds of them heading inland. Aerial recon spotted movement in ravines and tree lines where no friendly forces operated. Japanese officers were regrouping, not retreating. The battalion commander gathered his men, voice low and steady. Reinforcements were still days away. Communications with naval commanders were unstable, static-filled, barely holding through the storm-thickened atmosphere. If a counterattack came, they would fight tethered to nothing but their own resolve. No cavalry, no fallback lines. Just the ground beneath their boots. Weapon crews positioned machine guns along narrow corridors carved through the jungle. Mortar teams buried crates of ammunition beneath wet soil to keep them dry. Riflemen dug foxholes that filled with rainwater faster than they could shovel it out. Every man understood what was coming. The Japanese fought at night. Mass charges, drums, war cries that shattered silence. Units trained to die with honor rather than surrender. Fueled by a belief that death in battle was a sacred duty, the Marines had seen it before, hundreds rushing in waves, ignoring gunfire, stepping over bodies of their own comrades to close the distance. This time, the numbers were different. They weren't facing a scattered regiment. They were facing multiple coordinated battalions, well-armed, well-supplied, and eager to reclaim what they considered sacred imperial land. As dusk bled into night, a messenger burst into camp with confirmation. The counterattack would be enormous. The Japanese were moving in formation, fanning outward, preparing to encircle the American positions completely. Some Marines whispered that they should withdraw to safer ground closer to the coast, where naval batteries could cover them. Others argued for a defensive stand in the jungle interior, trusting close terrain to neutralize Japanese numbers. But the final decision belonged to the battalion commander. He stood over a map pinned beneath stones, rain dripping from his helmet, eyes fixed on the topography. The hills around them created a natural basin, deadly if they were caught inside it, devastating if the enemy entered unaware. He chose to stay. He ordered trenches deepened, firing arcs adjusted, and forward positions quietly abandoned to lure the enemy closer. Machine guns were placed where they could intersect their fire like crossing scissors. Mortar crews set fuses to detonate just above the treetops. Raining metal downward, the men exchanged glances, half fear, half disbelief. They weren't preparing to survive the encirclement, they were preparing to weaponize it. Hours later, as the sun vanished behind black clouds, the jungle exhaled its last whisper of wind. Leaves stilled. Birds vanished. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, and somewhere beyond the trees, you could hear them marching. The island that could not fall was about to become a graveyard, but no one yet knew for whom. Rain came first. Heavy, unbroken sheets that hammered against helmets and turned foxholes into muddy graves. Then came the artillery shells, tearing through the canopy like metal thunderbolts, exploding in flashes of white and orange that lit the night like lightning. Trees splintered. Earth geysered. The Marines barely had time to cover their heads before the first blast severed their last working radio. Line to the coast, static replaced command. Their lifeline to reinforcements was gone, for a moment. No one spoke. Officers tried dialing frequencies, pounding mud-caked receivers, adjusting antenna wires ripped by shrapnel. Nothing worked. The radios hissed back silence cold, merciless silence swallowing any hope that help was on its way. Then the scouts returned. They stumbled and soaked. Breathless, uniforms torn by branches and razor-sharp vines. They weren't bringing orders. They were bringing fear. Japanese battalions, plural, were advancing from multiple directions. North Ridge, southern coastline, dense western jungle. Their formations weren't scattered or disorganized. They were coordinated, deliberate, a complete encirclement, the kind no army walked away from. Men exchanged haunted looks, the realization settling in like a second monsoon. They were outnumbered, cut off, and surrounded on an island designed to bury them. Normally, that scenario would trigger only one logical response: retreat, pull back to the coast, fall under naval artillery cover. Escape into open terrain where machine guns could breathe and fire could spread freely, but that order never came. The battalion commander stood beneath a dripping canvas tarp, lantern light flickering across his face. His jaw was set, eyes fixed on the rain-smeared map pinned to a crate. Around him, junior officers waited for instructions orders that might save or doom all 800 men. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm. "We hold position." A stunned silence followed. Someone thought they misheard. Another officer stepped forward, voice rough from smoke. "Sir, if we stay, they'll surround us by dawn." He looked up. "That's the point." Shock rippled through the command tent. The Marines weren't staying because they were trapped. They were staying because they intended to finish the fight here before Japanese forces could reinforce, regroup, or launch attacks elsewhere on the island. If the enemy closed in too far, their numbers meant nothing. They would become targets packed shoulder to shoulder in killing lanes, a deadly gamble, a calculated slaughter. But only if executed with perfection. "Dig deeper," the commander said. "Tighten lines, no firing until ordered. We let them get close. Then we cut them apart." No one cheered, no one argued. They simply nodded and dispersed, knowing full well that a single mistake meant annihilation. The preparations began immediately. Riflemen carved fresh trenches into soil that fought back like stone. They worked until their hands blistered, until mud ran over their boots like wet cement. Machine gunners dragged their weapons into concealed nests behind fallen trees and jagged rocks, marking intersecting arcs of fire. Mortar teams unpacked crates in silence, murmuring prayers as they counted rounds like precious currency. Forward, observers studied maps by flashlight, plotting angles and distances for artillery strikes, coordinates pre-registered not outside the Marine perimeter, but inside it. If the enemy breached the lines, the Marines were prepared to call fire on their own position. Better to die in friendly fire than be butchered in hand-to-hand combat. Each man worked differently. Some moved with mechanical focus. Some trembled as they laid out ammunition belts. Some carved initials into rifle stocks as if preparing a tombstone. Others tried to ignore the truth. If the plan failed, they wouldn't just die, they'd disappear into the mud of a nameless island no history book bothered to mention. A young private, barely 19, stared into the darkness, his hands shaking around his canteen. He spoke only once, his voice cracking through the rain. "Sir, what if they break through us?" His sergeant looked at him, eyes hollow. "Then we hold until we can't. And after that?" The sergeant didn't answer. There was no after that. The jungle around them seemed to tighten with each passing minute. The horizon flashed again, artillery lighting the clouds like a ghostly sunrise. The Marines could hear movement now, distant but growing. The enemy wasn't rushing in. They were creeping, surrounding, studying, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The commander walked between positions, checking placements himself. He stopped beside a pair of machine gunners drenched in sweat and rain. "When they come," he said quietly, "they'll expect panic. They'll expect a broken line. They'll expect us to run." The gunner swallowed hard. "What do we do instead?" "We make them think they've won." Those words hung in the air like smoke, heavy, impossible, final. The plan wasn't to repel the attack head-on. It was to let the enemy cross a point of no return, a threshold where retreat became impossible and advancing meant walking into a corridor of bullets, no warning shots. No flares, no noise until the jungle floor was crawling with enemy troops, choked shoulder to shoulder in the dark. Then the sky would ignite, every trench, every bullet, every artillery coordinate. The entire night was being engineered for one coordinated moment of devastation. The men didn't need to understand the strategy to feel its weight. Every soldier could sense the tension tightening like barbed wire around their chests. They were being asked not just to fight but to wait, silent and motionless, while danger wrapped around them like a serpent, and somewhere deep in the jungle, branches snapped. Leaves trembled. Boots crushed wet soil. The encirclement was complete. The Marines lay low, fingers on triggers, breaths held, hearts pounding. They weren't trapped, they were waiting, or whether the trap would snap shut on the enemy, or on them, remained a question no man dared whisper into the rain. The night didn't fall. It descended like a predator. A thick blackness settled over the jungle, suffocating sound, swallowing light, turning every shadow into a threat. Even the moon refused to shine. Nothing moved except the rain, slow, cold, relentless, as if the sky itself was warning them that something terrible was coming. The Marines lay in the mud, drenched and silent, rifles angled just above the trench line. Their fingers hovered over triggers, but no one fired. No one dared break the quiet. Every man had been ordered to wait, and waiting, in that kind of darkness, felt like torture. Some tapped their boots nervously in the water pooling around their legs. Others closed their eyes, breathing slow and shallow. A few whispered prayers, promising God anything if they lived to see dawn. But most just stared into the void ahead, trying to see what they could only hear. Footsteps. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. Soft, padded steps, discipline masking desperation, moving with predatory caution. The Japanese weren't charging yet. They were creeping, testing, probing the perimeter. Scouts slipped through trees like ghosts, checking for weak points, marking paths with silent gestures. They believed they were the hunters. They believed the Americans were cornered prey. But as they moved deeper, the terrain betrayed them. What appeared to be open jungle was a kill zone, narrow corridors carved by machetes weeks earlier, forcing soldiers into funnels without realizing it. Fallen logs and rocks formed natural choke points. Dense vines masked trip lines. Trenches were dug low and wide, invisible until someone stepped directly over them. The Americans had turned the jungle into a labyrinth of death. Still, the Marines held their breath. The order was clear, no firing until the signal. The temptation to shoot was overwhelming. Shadows passed just feet from their barrels. At one point, a Japanese officer stood so close the Marines could hear his labored breathing, but the gun stayed quiet. Then the footsteps changed. They grew synchronized, heavier, faster. A faint whisper of shouted Japanese commands rippled through the brush. Not reconnaissance now, movement of entire battalions on the ridge to the north. Silhouettes appeared like shifting dark waves. In the west, metal clinked rifles being readied. From the southern tree line to the mountains inland, the enemy was closing their circle, tightening their noose. Then the drums started, a deep, rhythmic pounding, slow at first, then building into a warlike cadence that vibrated through the earth. Warriors shouted, voices rising in fevered cries. Steel flashed in the faint starlight. The Marines had heard this sound before at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. A banzai charge was coming, a mass assault meant to overwhelm by sheer force and chaos. Some Marines swallowed fear like glass. Others clenched teeth so hard they tasted blood. The commander signaled down the line using a silent hand gesture. Hold. Not yet. The Japanese surged forward. Branches snapped. Boots splashed. Breathless shouts echoed across the dark. Thousands moved at once, no longer silent hunters, but a tidal wave of flesh and steel, rushing headlong toward the barely visible Marine lines. Still, the Americans didn't fire. Their rifles trembled in their hands. The enemy reached the first markers, ribbons tied to low brush to measure distance. Still no gunfire. They surged past the second markers, closer. The Japanese believed victory was seconds away, and in that moment when the night was filled with screaming voices and pounding footsteps, when there was no turning back, a single flare ripped into the sky. It burst open in a blinding white star, raining sparks across the treetops. Night vanished. The jungle erupted into daylight. That was the signal. A wall of gunfire exploded across the Marine lines. Machine guns roared, spitting fire in intersecting arcs. Mortar launched shells that burst in the trees, shredding everything below with hot steel rain. Rifles cracked in fast bursts. Flamethrowers hissed, sending liquid fire into clusters of soldiers too tightly packed to escape. The first wave barely had time to scream. Bodies fell in heaps before momentum carried the ones behind straight into them. Men tripped, collapsed, were trampled by their own comrades as they tried to charge forward. The kill zone was alive. Tracer rounds sliced through smoke like burning threads. Artillery shells exploded in pre-designated zones where the ground had been specially cleared to maximize lethality. The air filled with dirt, leaves, blood, and the metallic stench of gunpowder. Japanese soldiers kept coming. They climbed over fallen bodies, through flames, over shattered logs. Officers screamed orders, sabers raised. Machine gun teams tried to return fire but collapsed under mortar strikes. The jungle echoed with agony shouts, explosions, gunfire, and the deep roar of concentrated death. Still they came. A second wave broke into the clearing, sprinting headlong through shredded trees, attempting to breach the Marine trenches. Some made it close enough for bayonets to clash, for knives to swing, for grenades to be pressed into mud and smothered by desperate hands. The Marines fought like men holding back a flood with their bare bodies. At one point, enemy soldiers breached a section of the northern trench. Gunfire turned to screams. A Marine swung his rifle like a club, smashing bone. Another tackled a soldier to the ground, both rolling into water and blood. A corpsman dragged a man with half a leg back behind cover. Ignoring bullets splintering the tree above him, the line bent but did not break. Then the commander shouted, "The next order! Drop fire on Grid 6. Observers signaled artillery batteries stationed miles away. Seconds later, shells whistled overhead and detonated inside the perimeter, the Americans shelling their own lines to kill the enemy swarming through. The earth convulsed under the explosions. Marines and enemy alike were thrown to the ground. Smoke engulfed everything. Firelight flickered through clouds of dirt and ash. The Japanese advance stalled. Bodies piling so high they formed makeshift barricades, but still they regrouped, still they rose, still they charged, wave after wave. Screaming, bleeding, dying, but refusing to retreat. Hours passed. The flare light faded. Battle raged in darkness lit only by gunfire and burning trees. The jungle, once alive with insects and wind, now pulsed with mechanical death. Marines cycled through their last ammunition magazines. Machine gun barrels glowed red-hot. Hands blistered, shoulders bruised, ears ringing, lungs burning from smoke. Somewhere a Marine whispered, "How many more?" No one answered. Because the jungle beyond them still moved. The enemy wasn't finished. They were only getting closer, and the Marines bloodied. Exhausted, half-deaf from explosions, tightened grips on their rifles, knowing the next wave would not just test their defenses. It would break them, unless they broke the enemy first. Dawn was still hours away, and night was far from over. The sun had long risen over Hane Ridge, but the world seemed slower, almost muted. The jungle, once alive with the cries of battle, now breathed a quiet, reluctant sigh. Birds returned to the trees. Wind whispered through the leaves. And among the mud and twisted foliage, the ghosts of the night still lingered. History would remember the Pacific War and sweeping campaigns, the massive invasions, the decisive victories, but not the battles that unfolded quietly, invisibly, where a few hundred men held the line against impossible odds. Hane Ridge was one of those battles. 800 Marines had faced a force 3 times their size and survived, not by retreat, not by overwhelming firepower, but by mastering the art of patience, anticipation, and calculated risk. The battlefield was littered with corpses, splintered trees, and shattered weapons, a testament to the cost of victory. Casualty numbers alone told part of the story. Roughly 800 Marines stood alive, battered and bleeding, against some 2,500 Japanese dead. Estimates varying depending on who counted and when, but numbers could not convey the intensity of fear, the weight of every heartbeat as the enemy drew closer, the hours spent waiting in utter silence while death encircled them like a predator. Commanders justified the tactic, allowing the enemy to close in, letting them step into a meticulously prepared kill zone as necessary. Without it, the island might have fallen. Supplies and reinforcements were too limited. Retreat was a death sentence, leaving open Hannay Ridge to the Japanese and potentially dooming thousands more in subsequent campaigns. But justification did not ease the burden on the men who had carried out the orders, nor on the survivors who had watched comrades die in fire and mud. The victory slowed Japanese reinforcements for weeks, protected crucial supply lines, and gave the United States a foothold that would ripple across the Solomon Islands campaign. More than that, the battle reshaped how small unit ambushes were conducted in the Pacific, how terrain could be turned into a weapon, how discipline and timing could amplify limited numbers against overwhelming force. In many ways, Hannay Ridge became a blueprint, though rarely cited, for future encounters in the Pacific theater. Yet, the psychological toll was immense. Marines wrote letters home with shaky hands, detailing nothing of the carnage, only reassurances that they were alive. Some journals spoke of friends who had vanished in minutes, swallowed by fire and metal. Others reflected in hushed tones about how close they had come to annihilation, how the night had felt endless, and how every decision had balanced on a knife's edge. The men knew they had survived something extraordinary, something history might forget. Hannay Ridge was not a headline. It would not be recounted in textbooks or in speeches. But for those who had waited silently in the mud, who had held their positions while enemy forces closed in, it became a defining moment of courage, strategy, and sacrifice. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not won by numbers or brute force. Sometimes they are won by letting the enemy step into their own grave by patience, calculation, and the willingness to endure unimaginable risk. Hannay Ridge was such a victory. Quiet, brutal, and almost invisible in the grand scope of war, but unforgettable to those who lived it, and lethal to those who underestimated it. And as the sun climbed higher over the ridge, painting the forest with the pale gold of morning, the story of that night remained etched into every scarred tree, every trench, and every man who had survived, waiting for history to remember, even if the world mostly forgot.